Hey folks, I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rocker. This is another episode of The Hole on the Corner, and I am finally joined by guests, as I've been promising for like a year or more now, saying I'll get other people on here to talk with me about Lafferty, and it's finally happened thanks to a lovely trio of really good guys that have joined me today. So I will let them introduce their names and their channels now. We'll throw to you, Richard.
I'm Richard Rempel, and I run a channel called Vintage SF. That's not San Francisco, that's science fiction.
Nice. Chris?
I'm Chris, and I am half of Liminal Spaces. I run a channel with my brother.
Nice. Okay, Virgil, go.
My name is Virgil, and I run a channel, Literally Books.
Cool. All right. Okay, so this was the plan for this, really a set of videos that this will be. And what I asked these guys to do was to read half a dozen short stories by R.A. Lafferty. Now, you'll know on my channel that I like to talk about Lafferty beyond the scope of science fiction and even genre fiction from time to time. But I also do like to talk about him in the context of science fiction as well. And I thought these channels, to one degree or another, are sometimes at least a little more science fiction focused. So I thought, let's just talk about Lafferty in that context, and let's read stories that pertain to that. And I chose particularly some of Lafferty's planetary stories or interplanetary stories because in one way or another, they actually all connect. So I asked these guys to read what I think are some of his weirdest and wildest planetary stories, and we'll be getting into that. Now, the idea here was I really wanted to talk about one main story called Thieving Bear Planet, and we'll get to that as the very last segment of this. But I thought there were some other stories we could look at in the background to reading that. So the deep dive will probably be on Thieving Bear Planet, but we may get more deeply into some of these other 5 stories. So here are the stories, and you'll have heard about them already if you're following my channel. They are, as mentioned, Thieving Bear Planet. There's a story called Snuffles, which if you're following Chris, you'll have heard him mention that already. The other stories are Ride a Tin Can, 900 Grandmothers, Once on Aranea, and World Abounding. So those are the stories we're going to be talking about. But first, here's what I thought we would do. And we're just taking our time and having some fun here. I hope you guys have fun with it as well. I would like to hear these guys' stories. And particularly what I want to hear is their story with science fiction. Now, I have a story, like what I think is like my lifelong relationship with science fiction. And I want to hear what these guys say about, how they came to science fiction or what it means to them or however they want to engage that idea. And we'll each tell our story with science fiction. And then we'll each go around and tell our kind of discovery of Lafferty, and especially in their cases, their impression of Lafferty so far. And that'll be our first segment. And then we'll launch into the stories. Also, I will mention, since, we're going through Past Master on my channel right now, those who have read it out of this group are free to bring in Past Master as a point of comparison from time to time as well. Unfortunately, Chris refuses point blank to read Past Master. So he can't be part of that. But we will make him jealous and make him wish he had read it.
There you go.
So, in terms of our story with SF so far, I want to start with Richard. And my thought here is that Richard is kind of our as his channel implies, his channel title implies, he's our vintage SF expert. He has surely read more 60s and 70s science fiction novels at this point than any of the rest of us. And so I feel like and a lot of that has been really, concentrated and recent in the past year or whatever. So I feel like he can speak to how Lafferty does or doesn't fit into that. That's my thought on limited impressions of his channel so far, but he can say what whether he thinks that's the case or not. Okay, so with that, Richard, take it away. Tell us your story.
Well, my story is really a media story to start out with, because I'm a child of the 60s. And one of the first things that I remember growing up on a farm with antenna TV, catching 3 channels, one of them was in French here in Canada, we actually got first run Star Trek in the late 60s. And my dad wanted to watch that. And of course, I wanted to stay up as much as I could and watch TV. And so I remember seeing first run Star Trek as a kid. And some of them were really scary to me. I was probably, like maybe 6 or 7 at the time. but that was my first impression. And then coming home from school, there'd always be reruns. And so I'd start to watch things like The Invaders, I just talked about recently on my channel, or Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. And another one was The Wild Wild West. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it kind of
Yeah.
has a almost a steampunk kind of feel to it, where there's some technology in advance of that time. But one of the ones that I really got into as I got a little bit older in the mid 70s, there was a series that came out called Space 1999. And
Mhm.
it had kind of an opening that was like 2001, but then there's that funky music all of a sudden would come in, and the moon had radiation canisters stored on it and exploded and blasted out of orbit. And then it was on a trip through the galaxy with weekly adventures. Love season one for those who've seen it. I'm not a big fan of season two. And I started to find the books about that. I was right at the age that I was starting to actually purchase books for myself that weren't just chapter books. And so I was interested in that. School library was the next big influence for me. That's where I found Clark. In particular, I really enjoyed Planet of the Apes by Pierre Boulle. When I found that one, it blew my mind what science fiction could be. Billion Names of God, short story by Arthur C. Clarke, was another one I remember as an early story that blew my mind. And from there, I started to discover some of the more traditional authors that most of us know. So I would say that kind of capsulates it. And that all happened prior to Star Wars. And I always think that
Wow.
Star Wars is kind of a delineation in terms of origin stories sometimes. Were you before or after Star Wars? Because it really changed the publishing industry in science fiction in my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great story. If I could just ask, going on a little bit as you got older, when did you start like reading like the novels and things, maybe as a regular thing, or what are your favorite things from the early time of first like getting into the novels? Because I have a few authors that were like kind of the first for me and stuff. So I'm curious about that with you.
So middle school was when I started to see some of these authors in the library. And then I was assigned in grade 9. I remember being assigned Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. And
Mm,
I was really taken by his writing. It connected and hit a core with me. And so
mm,
I sought out his books. And some viewers of my channel will know I have a collection of Wyndham books, and I do plan to talk about them more on my channel. But he became the one author that I wanted to read all of his work.
mm,
I've come across those kind of binging, I guess you could say, in reading
mhm,
with different
mhm.
authors, but he was definitely the first.
Cool. Okay, you were assigned Wyndham in school.
I was. And then we
Wow.
got to see the movie, which was not as good as the novel, of course, but it had its moments.
Oh, I love Day of the Triffids. I love that book. It's wonderful. First time I remember picking that up. It was a little older when I picked it up, and probably mid 20s, and just loved it. And Wyndham in general, just I really have enjoyed anything by him I've ever read. So that's awesome.
Space 1999. I enjoyed that. Not at the time. I watched it as reruns later, but yeah, I loved it.
Nice, nice.
I was always ripped
Um,
off when the scientist, I think his name was Victor Bergman, wasn't on the second season. I'm going, what are you doing? He's one of the best characters. He's kind of a Spock-like guy on the show.
Yep.
well, I have to confess that I still have not read one word of Wyndham, and I hear nothing but good things about Wyndham. So I really got to make time and get around to that.
Me too.
Um,
No Wyndham yet.
okay. Well, I feel a little better. Also, it's interesting. The way I don't know what it's like these days with online stuff and how this kind of things works, but like I was born in the 70s, but I consider myself more of an 80s kid. That's what I remember. But in the 80s, we had just endless reruns of all the stuff that you're talking about, Richard. Like every show you mentioned, I saw. Now, unfortunately, my memories of all that are vague in the extreme. I haven't revisited any of those, like Space 1999, Wild Wild West, and all that. but I loved them at the time. And I'll say some more that were important to me back then. But yeah, so that's a really cool story. And that actually helps me frame mine a little better, because a lot of mine is media related as well initially. Cool.
I do want to mention one of my favorite shows of all time, I only saw in reruns, was the original Twilight Zone. Just loved it. And that's where I guess my love of short stories comes from as well in science fiction.
Yeah. I will say that that original Twilight Zone had, out of probably all this sort of older stuff, that is what I see go on to other generations. Like my kids and stuff have all really liked it, still like it, and that kind of stuff. Pretty powerful that it could still do that.
Yeah.
Next, we have in the middle, Mr. Liminal himself. Chris is going to tell us his story now.
So, believe it or not, I'm very new to sci-fi. I have quite a few, like Richard. I grew up, the first thing I remember that was particularly sci-fi that I was obsessed with was Robotech. Which, yeah, I think I'm about your age, Daniel, but it would show late night on TV. So we would stay up, and sometimes we'd make it and sometimes we wouldn't. I was the youngest. My brother's 6 years older than me, so he would always be able to stay up and watch it, and I would try really hard. But I absolutely loved Robotech. I loved Transformers when they came out, but I didn't really connect. I mean, that's just really classic military sci-fi when you get right down to it. But I didn't connect it like that. As I got older, I really got into horror, which is kind of the path I went down. I went and lived with my real father for about a year in California when I was like 13. And that is the first time I met somebody that loved sci-fi. And that was my dad. And he showed me Star Trek: The Next Generation, which I really enjoyed. And then he was really loved 2001 and watched that movie with me. And he had read the book and basically spoke through the whole movie as we were watching it, telling me what it was about, which I never would have understood at all what was going on without my dad there telling me what it was about. And then I flirted along the edges of sci-fi. I read 1984 just because it seemed like such an important book. So I read it when I was a teenager. But yeah, I got into horror really big, and horror led me to Ray Bradbury. So if I would have to say who the first science fiction author for me, it was Ray Bradbury. And I really think that's because he's a strange science fiction author in that he sits on two genres, I think, horror and science fiction. Yep. We tried to watch Ray Bradbury theater the other about 6 months ago. I think we watched a bunch of them and were shocked by how little of it was science fiction. They had a tendency, probably because it was cheaper to do all of his horror stuff. But yeah, then I got big into my schooling and forgot and was reading only, highbrow literature or whatever they had me reading in school, which I really enjoyed. I love a lot of different types of stories, but I started going to a lot of estate sales and yard sales. It's something that my mom used to do with me that I was like, I just got into it again, and I started buying sci-fi books whenever I could, which was ridiculous because what had ended up happening is I had a library before I had read much of it at all, which felt ridiculous to me. So when we started the channel, this is funny, Richard, we've already been talking about this a little bit today, but I just picked the most educational looking science fiction book I could, and I picked this, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, which just today Richard started doing videos on, which I thought was incredible. I was so excited to watch that this morning, and this started the channel. If you go back to my first videos, I started talking about music, and then when I start talking about sci-fi, it's all stories from the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. So this channel for me has been just going through my library and figuring out what I want to read and what I don't want to read. And really, so I was obsessed with magical realism, Haruki Murakami, and the Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. Who did that one?
Marquez.
Yes, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I was obsessed with that kind of stuff, and science fiction led. I could get into science fiction because of that, I think, really easily, because the magic is just replaced with the science. And I find that really interesting as I'm going through. And I'm starting even to learn, like, what times. I feel like my channel knew what types of books I liked before I really did, which is wild, because then all these recommendations came in that were absolutely incredible. I'm not supposed to talk about Lafferty yet, right?
If it comes up, it's okay. But yeah,
yeah, that's how Lafferty came up, was because of Virgil and because of my channel. Somebody was just like, because I was obsessed with this dream machine trope, because I did that Zelazny video, the Dream Master, and that thing exploded. Like the price on eBay changed for that book because of my stupid video. I was in shock.
Wow.
So cool.
Yeah,
I mean, not for somebody who wanted to buy the story, obviously, but
right. I realized later I had bought a second edition instead of a first edition, and went back to try to get a first edition. Kind of screwed myself. But yeah, I was obsessed with that trope, and that's how I came to Lafferty. Is I saw Virgil talk about Past Master, and then somebody recommended there's a Dream Machine Lafferty story that you absolutely must read.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that. I am going to stop you on the Lafferty stuff, though. There, hey,
okay.
If there's more you want to say about your story with science fiction, though, that's cool.
No, I just I started with the Golden Age. I mean, every one of these stories told me which writers I should pursue next. I was like, okay, the Microcosmic God, which you talked about today, Richard, is incredible. I got to go check out more. Sturgeon?
Yes.
Okay, good. Cordwainer Smith in here was insane, and so on and so forth. And then I discovered the new wave of science fiction and jumped into that. But yeah. Oh, and I started watching BookTube before I started reading all these. So I was watching Richard and Outlaw Bookseller and Moyd and Mike's Book Reviews and all these different booktubers, just getting an idea of kind of what I wanted to do. So yeah, I feel really young in science fiction. Honestly, I really do. This is kind of new to me, which is why I've never read a word of Wyndham and stuff like that, because I eventually I'm going to go through this, and the channel is just kind of that journey is just me jumping into sci-fi, because I always knew I'd like it. I just never had the time. I was either schooling or I was obsessed with horror or whatever to jump into sci-fi. So yeah,
that's great. I mean, I love that. There's so many different approaches and entryways to this kind of stuff. And to see somebody, who's been reading forever, but just now getting into science fiction, or, that could be with some other genre or something, that's as fun as anything. That's so cool. Yeah. I forgot to say when I tossed it over to Chris there that from what I've seen of his channel so far, I'm still just getting familiar with all three of these channels. But I think what he can bring to looking at Lafferty is that emphasis that he has on like mythology and sort of depth psychology and that kind of thing. Would you say that's somewhat accurate, maybe, Chris?
Definitely with the mythology. Yeah, I have a big background in myth and folk and fairy tales. I studied that quite a bit in my schooling. Psychology, I have no idea about. Never even taken a psychology course, but I do like character motivation, and I think about that a lot when I break down books.
Well, I suppose we'll get to a bit of this eventually, but it's based on the way you talked about Lafferty's story, configuration of the North Shore. You have an intuitive grasp because of your love of mythology. That has a lot to do with like Jungian psychology and stuff of, kind of deep things going on in people's psyche and soul, if you want to call it that, etc. But yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, I think that's what you bring to our Lafferty discussion, and I'm excited about that. And it's amazing. There's so many crossovers I have with these stories. So let us hear now from Virgil. Take it away.
Okay, so I'm trying to think. How did I get introduced to science fiction? I think probably it started with really pulpy cartoons when I was younger, like Thundar the Barbarian and He-Man and stuff like that. I mean, I just loved it. I just loved that, and I still do. I still like unabashedly love this sort of science fantasy. That literally is the genre that I love the most, which seems strange, but I just do. So I sort of started with that, and then at some point not really a lot of connection with like more cerebral science fiction. Like I know never really honestly watched Star Trek until I was till my 30s. Not that I had a problem with it. It was on like, oh, this is good. And I'd maybe see an episode and then that was be it. Except for maybe Doctor Who. We watched a lot of Doctor Who on Sunday nights on PBS. We'd see that, so we caught a lot of Doctor Who, and I like that. And then as I got, maybe middle years, 10, 12, somewhere in there, I enjoyed reading. And I think probably my first intro into sci-fi literature was probably Orson Scott Card, and it would have been Ender's Game. And I read Ender's Game, and it just, especially that book, that ending, even now I can get chills thinking about what a snap ending that book was and how well executed it was. And I just loved it. And then the sequel, Speaker for the Dead, which was such a flip, so completely different. And I absolutely love Speaker for the Dead. I think it's such a really wonderful reversal in a sense of the theme of the first book, so I don't know if Card is quite as popular as it used to be, but I still enjoyed that series especially. Did Asimov and liked Asimov, did the Foundation trilogy, which I have so little memory of because it's been so long, and messed with science fiction a bit. And then it honestly was really but still was sort of a more fantasy fan. Still read a lot of fantasy, loved Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. And then it was really Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. I know that might be a trope I'm hitting on too much, but it was that I found that book and I read that and I thought, I think this is better than Lord of the Rings. I think I like this more. I don't know, better might be the wrong thing to say, but I like it more. And that just sort of, and it was just so wonderful to see this Thundar type story, right? This science fantasy story, but somebody writing it like it was literature. And I'm like, this is what I've always waited for. This is so good. And it was just that approach, that genre fiction taken seriously, these very pulpy ideas and with a serious tone. I just absolutely love it. And then more recently read, like somebody recommended to me from Reddit, Frederick Pohl's Gateway. And that's a very pulpy intro story that is honestly not science fiction at all. It's a very human story. I just loved it. And so those stories, I love the pulpy stuff too. I do love just pure pulpy silliness and just fun. I enjoy all of it. What is this? Somebody call it candy fiction. This or popcorn fiction, somebody called it one time. Just that touch, that sort of a little bit extra touch when someone writes with not just in the quality of the writing, but maybe a theme or something that Wyndham, for example, had. I really enjoyed Day of the Triffids. It was an excellent book. Or like The Star is My Destination, another excellent one that I love. So, that's just sort of where it is. I engage with lots of science fiction and other stuff too, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I forgot to say before I hand it to you that the thing that from my limited exposure to your channel so far that I think you might bring to Lafferty discussion is out of the four of us, I feel like you cover a slightly wider range than any of us of different kinds of literature, everything from, cowboys and samurais to, some, I don't know what to call it. I don't really like the term mainstream fiction or whatever, but more drama oriented that doesn't necessarily have to have a genre aspect to it and those kinds of things. And I'm sure we all read that widely, but you seem to cover that on your channel the most. And so I like to think, as I said at the beginning, of Lafferty in those contexts as well. I actually think Lafferty is kind of like a great American author, sort of, in addition to this really weird sci-fi guy or whatever, that kind of thing. That's my take,
Yeah.
So I think you can kind of, you might have something to say to that as well. What do you think about that?
I agree. And that's, something I guess another aspect to something I enjoy in reading is just, I like when a writer does something different, because that was one of the biggest reasons I moved away from fantasy in the mid 90s, was just because it was all the same. It was like, I've already read, this is just Lord of the Rings again. I've already read this story. Not that the writing would be bad, but it was just like, I've already read this. And that's what I think I like about science fiction, is it's always trying something different. Whether it doesn't even have to be super successful for me. It's like that it tried means a lot to me. Yeah. Or that a writer would try something unusual that maybe doesn't work, but I can appreciate the effort or the technique. So, not to get into Lafferty, but that's too much, but that is something I notice about his writing.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I always talk about how I love art that, like, not everything that tries and sort of, doesn't get there is exciting to me. But a lot of my favorite stuff is stuff that's just reaching so hard beyond what that person is capable of, but their reach is awesome. Like, I just love to watch them almost get there, that kind of thing. I love that kind of stuff.
Totally.
And also, my mind has now exploded, and I don't even know if I'm going to be able to have the rest of this conversation, because the idea that the Book of the New Sun is Thundar as literature is like the best description of that work I have ever heard. I just love that so
I mean,
much.
this is where it came from. That's how I got there.
And I think a lot of Wolf readers would appreciate that capsule description, just because we all know that we just straight up love like the swords and the monsters and whatever in there. And does he also write like a great literary author? Yes. And so it's like, all that together, but it's not like, we put up with the swords and the monsters or whatever because he's such a good, it's like, no, we kind of came for the swords and monsters and right. Whoa, these sentences are amazing,
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, guys. That was a pleasure to hear. And you've really helped me think about mine. And I'll try to be as brief as I possibly can. But I was forgetting about a lot of my influences, like cartoons, like Robotech. Oh my God, I love Robotech. We were lucky enough that it came on, I think, in the afternoons after school, and watched that. And one of the things, I'm not into military sci-fi like at all. But I think there's something about those mech in some other shows, like, Evangelion and stuff, that is quite like a monster or something magical or something to me. It's not just like this robot. It's like a weird thing that transforms. And they did weird stuff on that show. I don't know if you remember, like the giant ship that they lived on and had homes in, and there were like malls and all kinds of things in there. They
didn't even understand the entirety of the ship.
Right. And there's like a moment, or maybe there's several, but where it has to transform into like a mech thing, and it like ruins their lives. They like because the inside, like the malls and the homes are all like shifting around. They're like, where do we go? Like, that's my big memory of it anyway. And also it that was the first time I ever encountered this whole idea of like real main characters getting killed in the middle of a season or something. And I was like, what is this? This is, it just went right past like Saturday morning cartoons and everything. I was like, okay, I'm really on board. This is strange. But so like cartoons and Thundar, and oh my God, I loved Thundar the Barbarian. All this. I really need to go back and watch all this stuff. So yeah, all that good stuff. Also, the early TV shows. For me, I did see the early Star Trek. I will say it was really cool the way you said about the Star Wars thing, and I think you're exactly right. And I'm on the other side of that. I'm a Star Wars kid for sure. And I saw the Star Trek stuff growing up, although I think I had already seen Star Wars by the time I was watching Star Trek on TV. And I've just never been a fan of Star Trek. I don't mind it. I liked it enough when I was a kid. When the new Next Generation was coming out, I had some flatmate or some roommates that were watching it every night, and I watched it and I enjoyed it, and sometimes it has that like Twilight Zone quality in the episodes, which is really fun. I've tried the new ones. I bounce off of them every time. That's just me, whatever, but the Star Wars original trilogy, I don't like much of what's come after. I wanted to, but I just don't love it. But is a real landmark for me. So yeah, I'm a Star Wars kid. But with TV shows, I saw all the stuff you've mentioned, but the stuff that really stuck out to me, strangely enough, the one I can remember the earliest is old black and white. I don't know if you guys have ever seen these, Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. So I don't know when it was made, the 40s or something, 50s. But they would show them in the afternoon on TV, and I was like a little kid just glued to that stuff. My parents like even thought it was like hilarious. They're like, you like this? Because it's like really fakey looking with these bad outfits and ray guns and stuff. And they're like 10-minute episodes or something. But yeah, so that kind of stuff. And that's the thing for me with science fiction is it took me quite some time to get to the literature itself. But I have always felt like I'm true blue science fiction fan. I've loved it since I was a kid, but it was more through films and TV, and if there were comic books, cartoons, and anything like from the library that would like, I remember getting these books that would like predict, like just be fully illustrated, predicting what the future technology was going to be like with flying cars and stuff. And I was like eating that stuff up, and the science fiction versions of Choose Your Own Adventure and all this kind of stuff. Like I was really into any and all of that but my first literary stuff was more fantasy, reading The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. I went in with the face because a friend was reading them, trading back and forth a bunch of Dragonlance novels of all things.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was a big Dragonlance, the original trilogy. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I read it. Oh yeah,
that was a big part for a minute. But yeah, so I kind of, in terms of literature, but actually even before that would be, well, I read the Chronicles of Narnia also when I was quite young, like really little. And the other thing I read when I was really little, strangely enough, had this like copy of the Tales of Edgar Allan Poe. So I've said before that my whole imagination and the way I write and stuff, I didn't choose it. I kind of wish I could have chose some different like influences, but it's like this weird mixture of like C.S. Lewis and Edgar Allan Poe. It's so bizarre, but that's my formative imagination. It's developed since then, but that's still with me. So for me, like Chris, horror is right there with science fiction. And to this day, I can't decide if they're equal, or if the one is a little like more of the core of me than the other is probably is horror, to be honest. And so horror is more my baby and more what I seek out. And then I just keep circling back to science fiction and getting a little more and a little more. What happened with me is in my early 20s, I also found a bookstore that was selling 60s and 70s anthologies and stuff for really cheap. And so I was like starting to pick these up and reading, Zelazny and Ellison and Delaney, and there's some Wolf in there, Le Guin, all these people, and it was just great. Oh, real quick, before that, I did start in late high school with some Asimov, which like a collection of short stories, which at the time blew my mind, right? And I read that and I was like, Asimov, and then I read these 70s new wave stuff, right? And I was like, let me get back to some Asimov, and started to read it. I was like, I hate this. I did not like this writing at all. Like, I can't stand it, because I'm just like, no, bring me back to the like formal experimentation and poetic, words and everything. So I still need to try to circle back to Asimov at some point. But the problem that happened to me was first I got locked into the 60s and 70s, and I couldn't seem to get to either side of that for years. And within those anthologies, I discovered some bloke called Raphael Aloysius Lafferty, and he was just like one of those names in there. It's like, ooh, another Lafferty, another Delaney, and it was like another Lafferty, another Lafferty. And I just went to the bookstore, and all I did was go down the contents. Is there a Lafferty? That's coming home. Is there a Lafferty? That's coming out. And that's like, and then I just like forgot about everything else and obsessed over Lafferty forever. What brought me back just a tiny bit was I did finally, get into Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. I kind of bounced off that. I really liked it, but I didn't finish the whole thing at first. Came back to it sometime later. And I think I read like the first of the Book of the Short Sun. And I was like, I really loved it. And I was like, okay, time out. I need to read everything I can by Gene Wolfe. And I've read almost everything up to, kind of his mid to late novels, at this point. And I haven't looked into him for a while, but there was a section where I was like obsessed with Gene Wolfe. So I've read a ton of Gene Wolfe, the whole solar cycle, lots of short stories, lots of standalone novels, The Wizard Knight, all that good stuff. Yeah. So he kind of although he's another one that's like, a lot of people that maybe not massively into science fiction might like Gene Wolfe. So I keep having these authors that are like, yes, they're firmly science fiction, but I still get. So finally, through again another crossover like Chris, watching BookTube, I'm like, and I have to give Matt from BookBuild is like a superstar at this point, but I have to give him, and there's nothing wrong with that. I enjoy his videos right up to this moment, but his early top 15. Like stirred my soul. Like I was just like, the way you talk about these is beautiful. And some of them have hit for me very similar for how they hit for him. And some have not at all. I'm like, how did you get that out of that? But you know what? This goes back to my whole idea about a mythos about talking about Lafferty. It works with other authors too. There's something beautiful just about what's special to somebody in the way they sum it up, even if you can't get that out of the reading experience. So I get that from some of these booktubers. But through that, I finally have read A Dish, which was awesome. A D.G. Compton, which was awesome. What's his name? J.G. Ballard, and I'm loving it. Like some things are not hitting for me, but some really are. And I'm like, oh, finally, I found this other great sci-fi, especially from the era I really liked, 60s and 70s. And I'm planning on making videos about those. I will eventually, but it took me a while to get to the literature part, and I'm still kind of finding my way with science fiction, even though it's really deep in my bones, and I love it dearly. Okay, I think that's all I need to say about my story. now let's more briefly go around and talk about how we discovered Lafferty and first impressions, maybe up to the moment, because we're going to come back to this after we've had our discussion and see if it's changed since reading this new set of stories. But if that comes into what you need to say right now, that's fine. So Richard, tell us about your encounters with Lafferty.
Well, when Chris was saying that the audience kind of helped him shape what he was doing on BookTube, that happened with me a little bit as well. I started to get a couple of books that were from the A Science Fiction Specials Series 1 that had these amazing covers by Leo and Diane Dillon. And then one of the booktubers, Kenny RH, hi Kenny, talked about them and talked about the series. And I decided I'm going to go for it. This is going to be kind of my first big collecting since starting BookTube. And so I got all the books and I decided to read through them all. There was 38 of them. And I have done that. But in there was Lafferty. Never saw Lafferty before. Started with Past Master, then Fourth Mansions. And some of you have seen the videos. I found him perplexing, a conundrum. There's parts of it I got and I liked. And then there's things I couldn't follow a stream of story. I didn't know if there was a stream of story. I wanted that narrative, but I wasn't finding it. But I knew lots of writers loved Lafferty. And then I got to 900 Grandmothers. This is the first short stories collection. And that's where I got it, especially the lead story, 900 Grandmothers. I could release myself to his whimsical, funny, yet horrific type of storytelling. I still, to this day, to some of the stories that you gave us, there's a lot of horror in there, couched in a very comical fashion. And I think that Chris, when he was talking about Snuffles and his channel there, that would be a horror movie if they made a movie of that one. So that opened it up. I also read The Best of R.A. Lafferty, which had some great writers talking about each of the stories. And that also helped unlock it a little bit more for me. From then on, rereading stories. I've reread some of Past Masters since you started going through the chapters. Rereading has actually really unlocked him even more for me. And I think it's difficult to promote rereading stories like, the Thieving Bear Planet that we're going to talk about. I've read it a second and third time, and boy, I get it so much better than just reading through something once. And so if you're trying to understand Lafferty, my recommendation would always be to go to the short stories and read them a couple times, and you may start to get the flavor for what he's doing. So that's pretty much where I'm up to now. I plan to read Space Shanty over here. It's an ace double. It's a shorter book. It's a retelling of, what is it, the Odyssey? And I appreciate you inviting me here so that I could read some more and to learn from the master of Lafferty here.
Yes, I am the master of Lafferty. Yeah, so I saw Richard's little saga with Lafferty as it came up because I don't have alerts or whatever. I don't know if you can do that on YouTube. But anyway, I always am like searching and see is anybody, because I'm desperate for somebody to talk about it. It's the whole reason I've done this channel. I would not do it if somebody would like cover it as in depth as I'm doing. I would rather listen to somebody else. But yeah, so I had to, I had to calm myself as he's going through Past Master and Fourth Nations. I'm like, that's fair. That's fair. That's not everybody's into his novels and not, and I'm like stewing over here going, it's all right. So when he came to 900 Grandmothers, I was like, oh, thank God. I can be friends with this guy. But that's, you are far from alone. That is I would say that's the majority view of Lafferty. And I totally understand it. I'm just always like, fighting the corner for his novels and stuff. But, I will say, as I looked back over your videos and stuff, I realized I was just so like, love these novels, that I was missing how nuanced actually your responses were, because you were very clearly every time going, I like this writing. This is good writing. I'm interested in this writing. I don't understand the story. And it's like, well, that's like half the battle if you actually like the writing, you know what I mean? Like, and that's like saying a lot, so that's really cool. So as to the rereading Lafferty, I actually would love to see it become a mantra or the given wisdom or whatever about Lafferty the same as it is about Gene Wolfe. That people say you haven't read Wolfe until you've read him the second time. It's a little different with Lafferty, but in many ways that is very true of Lafferty. You just really haven't read this stuff until you've gone through it a second time. I do think, for some readers, certain stories will be just so impactful on a first go. But even then, you haven't even touched what it's about yet. You know what I mean? Or all the treasures that it has there, at least in many, many, many cases. And of course, this is even more so the case with the novels that, in their way, are, in some ways border on being as complex as Gene Wolfe's works, just in such a different way, very similar ways in some respects, but also in different ways that you kind of have to acclimate to. In that sense, Gene Wolfe is a more accessible writer, is as much of a writer's writer that Wolfe is, and that he has like a more narrow fan base. Even though it's huge, it's still not as big as like the big mainstream guys, because you have to put some work into it and stuff, and it's quite literary. He is more mainstream or accessible than Lafferty. I don't think that's too controversial to say. Also, it's not a chore. It's not like like an assignment or something to reread Lafferty. Well, I don't know what you guys think. We'll hear from you about this. But for me, it's a pleasure to reread Lafferty, that you get more out of it, and the stories just start to, expand and expand and get richer and richer. As they say, it repays rereading. So it's worth it on that level.
I'm going to add one more thing, because you're wanting to write up to date. What the last thing I've done after reading the stories that you assigned us, and I've read some of these other stories here, is I started putting down all the worlds of Lafferty, from the suns that we had here and all the worlds and how they're interconnected. And I was going, and Chris, you had mentioned Cordwainer Smith. His universe is called the instrumentality of humankind, something like that. This is an interconnected universe. And I honestly, after reading 3 books here, I hadn't realized that until I read these other stories that you assigned us. And I'm going, hang on a second. There's something here from this previous story, So I was piecing that together a little bit. And I don't know about other people, but I get excited by an interconnected universe and seeing how these things fit together.
Yeah, 100%. And we are going to get into that. And it's funny because before we started recording, Chris was saying something similar about like starting to map out like what's going on here, with these planets and stuff. So yeah, that's great. Thank you, Richard. That was really, really interesting to hear. We're going to break our pattern here. We're going to take the liminal guy out of the liminal spot and save him for the end, because as we'll see, Chris came to Lafferty through Virgil's coverage of Past Master. So let's throw it to Virgil next. What's your story with Lafferty so far?
Okay, and this is a very liminal thing for Chris to be shifting all around, and we don't really know where he's going to end up. So that fits. So for me, I had seen a post someone did about an interview that Gene Wolfe had done, and in this interview, which I really enjoyed, and I linked in the video I did on Past Master, Gene Wolfe just talks about various things, and he talks about what he was reading then. And he said, "I'm reading R.A. Lafferty," and I thought, I don't know that I know that name, or maybe I've seen it, but I don't know that I've ever read anything. So then I'm trying to look something up. I'm like, oh, there's like if you have an Audible account, there's the Past Master is free. I'm like, well, I've got tomorrow that I've got all this time. I was going to read something. I just finished a book. I'm like, he said he liked it. Okay, sure, let's try it. And so that was it. I didn't even know what Past Master was about. Like I didn't even read a synopsis of it or anything. I was just like, okay, download. So now I'm listening to this. I thought, okay, this is interesting. This is an interesting start to a story. All right. And I don't know why. I hesitate to say it because I can't really defend it. But my initial impression of Lafferty was that he was a British writer. I don't know why I thought that. I really thought he was a UK writer. It just felt like that. And it was only after I was almost done and I looked up a bio, I'm like, oh, no, he's from the Midwest. Really? I had a real like strange moment where I was like, okay, sure, okay, maybe that does work. All right, strange. Anyhow, and then just
I'm gonna jump in there and just say there is a reason for that, because it's an English guy reading that audiobook.
Yes? I guess that helps, but even even something in the quality, the maybe it's because of Moore's voice, the way that like his narrative, like dialogue, feels. I mean, obviously it should feels British, even though it's archaic. Maybe that's helping, but there was something very early. It just felt like a UK writer. So I don't know
Hmm.
why. Maybe it was like the decisions that he was making, writing decisions didn't seem like standard US science fiction of that era. It just
Hmm.
didn't feel like
A lot
that.
of people do that with Poe. I find
Hmm.
a lot of students when we're doing Poe all think Poe is English,
Yeah.
and then are shocked to learn that he was a Southern gentleman.
I I would love for us to get into a deep dive on the details of Lafferty's prose. That would be amazing, but I think it's going to be super off topic. But I will say you're definitely on to something, Virgil. And I've noticed this more and more because to me, Lafferty is quintessentially American and he speaks in a Oklahoman register and so on. But he has a cadence often that I think comes from his early reading. He read like I don't know how to say this name, but Balzac, you know, and Chesterton and some British or European writers in addition to the likes of Twain and stuff. And I really think that that comes in. So yeah, your impression is not wrong. But anyway,
Yeah.
carry on with your story about
I didn't really have language about it. Yeah, but that makes sense. He's just using like little, I don't know, structures that I felt like were archaic, sort of British writing structures that I liked. But anyhow, so I was still, so I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, okay, I think I like this. I think I like this. And I think the real decision moment for me, which is going to seem strange to say, when I really like, I know I do like this writer, I do like it, was this moment in Past Master where I think it's Proctor goes to Paul and he's like, I want you to go get Thomas More. And he's like, okay, see you later. And he's like, wait a minute. Wait, what? No, you don't even know what to do. And he's like, I don't need you to tell me. He's like, you came to me. And I loved the shorthand that Lafferty gave us there. I like, okay, this is a guy who's not worried about explaining everything. He's like, you understand what needs to happen. I understand what needs to happen. We don't need to go through all the song and dance. Paul is ready to go and he just does it. And I thought, I like that. I like that he didn't stick to a normal structure, that he just broke that in half and threw the rest of the way that he didn't need and just kept going. And it worked. And I just felt like more and more in that novel that there was choices made that were, it was like, you know what I'm going to do. And I know what I'm going to do. Do we really have to do this? Let's just go ahead. And it's all throughout the whole book. It felt like there's just all these sort of like little, and that just of his writing. And I think I said in my review that his stuff feels tight, and it does. It feels like
mm-hmm.
he's tightened everything down. Everything's torqued up. It's all ready. It's all packaged up real nice. I don't know, and I just really enjoyed that. I just really liked that style. And I'm not going to say that I understand Past Master 100%, but I feel like I have an understanding of it, and I just really enjoyed the journey, and I enjoyed that there was things to discover. And I guess like Wolf, he's got things to unpack, but where Wolf seems to be more puzzly,
Mm-hmm.
Lafferty, it's more like impressions, and you're having to like, it's less like go look something up and more like, well, how is that description, what is that making me think about? I don't
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
And I just and then I think in the reading that we did, there was something where there was a phrase that somewhere a character said, I don't remember where, what story, where he says, no pat phrases. There's no pat phrase. And I felt like that's very much sums up Lafferty's writing. No pat is like, I am not going to use a normal description for this thing, for this thing. I'm going to shuck that every single time. And I just appreciated it from that. And I don't know, just enjoyed the experience a lot.
Thank you. That is awesome. I'm over here like smiling and laughing and just like enjoying because this is why I have like stalked you guys and like made whole videos going. So then they said this and then they said that because it's just you can't imagine what it's like to like an author this obscure and out of print and kind of have no one to talk to about it. Obviously I have found the other Lafferty fans online and we've had those conversations. But the truth be told, it's been a while since new numbers have come, or at least new numbers who are vocal and want to like talk about it. Because we used to be on like I did a blog a long time ago on him and people would comment and we had these epic discussions, but that's all the past now, so like hearing your guys' fresh takes, and I'm like, yes, thank you, right, so like the fact that, and again, I totally get it, that it's just your mileage may vary and all these different kinds of things, but some people really appreciate what I often call his concision there, and that sense of like, yeah, let's get her done, let's like we're moving on, you do the work, come back to it if you don't understand, let's go work, yeah, and that you liked that, and I made a big deal of you calling it tight. I was like, I've never heard anybody say that about Lafferty. It's tight. I was like, I love that. It is tight, and you just explained it like even better than you did before. So like, I think the more we discuss these things, the more kind of clarity comes out about what is happening here. Because famously, and this is what we all used to talk about many years ago, is like, we all know something is happening here, but as soon as we open our mouths or try to type something as to how this works or what's going on, we're lost,
Yeah.
And like more than other like difficult writers, there's something different here going on that just defies, kind of talking about it. So it's reaching more and more levels of clarity the more you say these things. There was one more thing you said. I was just thinking, I just want like an advert of like shots of the cover of Pastmaster or something with your voice going, what did you say? It's all torqued up. It's ready to go. Like, here it is for you. Get your Lafferty now,
That's just how it feels. I don't know. I really appreciate it. But at the same time, I'm reading this, I think, well, I could see why this is a difficult writer for some people because some people wouldn't like that. They'd say, but this, or it's so different that your expectation, if you don't push past that initial expectation, I guess, that you have, yeah, I could see where someone could say, I just didn't connect with it. I think for me, it was the fact that a writer that I really liked said, I really like this writer. And I thought, well, okay, I need to really give this a good chance. And that helped me that gave me the energy to make sure that I didn't just give it a cursory look and say, then like, oh no, there's something really here that's wonderful to appreciate. So I don't know.
No, you're right. That's super important. An author that you cherished said, I love this stuff. And that made you want to try, and I'm sure that helps some readers. Yeah. And it's just funny because I had really cooled off about like trying to get people to like Lafferty and hearing them bounce off him. I had finally made my peace with that. It was just like, that's fine. He's a niche writer, whatever. But hearing you guys actually like him has like reignited my like passion and jealousy for like, no, you need to like Lafferty. Come on, you're missing out. I was like, oh man, you guys totally ruined my zen about this in a great way. Like, I'm so happy and having fun, but I'm also like getting all tight again. So it's great. It's great. Okay, thank you for that.
I just wanted to add to Virgil what you said about your favorite writer liking him. That was something that I noticed that really helped me keep pushing through these books, was how many of the awesome writers of the 60s and 70s were saying, this is the guy I want to read. This is the guy I want to be, not like, but emulate his stretch towards more literary and interesting writing.
Yes, definitely. The other thing, it reminds me of those Zelazny quotes on so many of those books that are just like these, like I really felt like he really, like Zelazny must really like this guy because he really spent some time with this. This isn't like just sort of oh, you guys need a quote? That'll do. I can sort of imagine he sat there and thought for like, what am I going to say? And I think that shows something. It shows something special is going on.
That's a really good point, Virgil. I think Delaney and Ellison and Zelazny in particular were each like, what? You want me to blurb Lafferty? And they're like, okay, I got to bounce off like what he's doing here. I got to kind of come up, meet him at that level and like do some wordplay and stuff. And they have these wonderful blurbs, as you know, I've talked far too much about on my channel. And also, Richard, thank you for coming in there because that is a good example of what I think Richard brings in that, you're kind of soaking yourself in these guys like Zelazny and others. And then you're seeing them say these things about Lafferty. And you're like, well, he's definitely somebody to keep my eye on and keep trying for. So that's cool. Right, let's throw it to Chris. Tell us your story with Lafferty.
Yeah, my story does connect with Virgil's story. I think, Richard, I had seen your video on Past Master. It seemed like it didn't seem like something I would be interested in. And I don't know when. I think you did 900 Grandmothers later, after we had done our other videos, because your 900 Grandmothers video, I was so excited to read that story for this conversation because of how you talked about it and the little tiny grandmas laughing. But I went to my hometown. We still have my grandmother's house in this tiny town in Utah, and there's not any good internet there at all. And I went there, and we went into a town, a slightly larger town, and I had about an hour while I was there, and Virgil had put up his video on Past Masters. So I was like watching on my phone in this tiny town, and Virgil was saying the weirdest stuff. And I think I commented once and said each sentence Virgil said in that video was weirder than the one before it. And I think that is like the most accurate way to describe this the way Virgil was talking about this book, because I mean, I don't know if you're, I know there's spoilers here, but Virgil was like, he asked Thomas More to go, or he's going to go into the past to ask Thomas More to lead this utopia. And I was like, well, that makes sense, utopia. And then he shows up and Thomas More is like, oh, not you guys again. And I was like, what the hell? And then it just got weirder and weirder and weirder as he discussed it. So I was like, this guy sounds like a strange writer. And then one of my subscribers at that point said, you got to read the Configuration of the North Shore by R.A. Lafferty, because it's a Dream Machine book. And I didn't have a copy of it. I do now, but I didn't have a copy of it then. And then I just one day was like, I need to find the Lafferty story for this channel, but I don't have the Dream Machine one. So I'm going to see what I have. And I went through my library, and I've actually done it again. Unfortunately, I'm blocking it, but if you look back here, this horizontal stack of books are every anthology that I have that includes Lafferty, and then all the magazines behind me, If and Galaxy, also include Lafferty. So I was just randomly going through. The first one I grabbed was this horror magazine that's right behind my shoulder here, and I was like, okay, this is Thomas More, gender switching when you go back in time, Lafferty. I'm so excited. And it was like scary stories to tell in the dark, tall tales. Like, it felt like my youth. And it's funny, you said Lafferty's a Midwest writer, and I'm sure that we're going to have to talk about this a lot, because I think he's kind of a Southwest writer, which is interesting. I feel like the more I've looked into him, I feel like the Southwest tries to claim him as well. But yeah, I was really shocked. And then I've really mapped out my journey, but I went through these weird, random, there was no rhyme nor reason to how I went through these stories. One of them, Virgil, was in that book that was part 2 of the series you got at the library. And it was just, I mean, first there was like a PTA that went to another planet to see how people educated their children on this other planet. And then there was these kids that were like having a what seemed like a cheerleading competition that was magically changing the weather, that ended with like the creatures from the past raining down on this. And every story, I was just more dumbfounded and more dumbfounded. One where this angel has to watch monkeys type on a typewriter until one of them makes Shakespeare. I think they get all the way, but they forgot a the, and he has to start over. It's insane. And then I just couldn't pick one. So I finally did what I try not to do, and that is I just looked it up on the internet, and I've gotten a little more comfortable doing this. I usually like to have the books present, but I looked up the North Shore, and that story really touched me. It was it created a kind of, and I think I talked a little bit about liminality, not as space, but as cultural space in my video. And I felt like that the North Shore is this interesting cultural liminal space where the things that people dream about that become the places of all nostalgia and all desire, and the North Shore was so brilliant in the way that it described that, and then put a hijacking psychologist in there to steal it, and at the end pointing his finger directly at the reader. It was to me, I wouldn't even, and I know we're going to get into this, I wouldn't call that a science fiction story. I would call that a magical realism story, hands down. That is of the same writing style as Murakami and Marquez and all of these magical realism writers. And I think that it's a shame that he's ignored in that circle, because I never heard his name until science fiction. And I think he has a wide range from folk tales or tall tales all the way up to literature that should be talked about in colleges. I feel a lot more than it is. I really do. So yeah, I've enjoyed it. And then this round, which we'll get into later, has completely inspired me again, because it's a whole new group of stories. Like I would almost not be able to believe these were all the same guy. It is incredible, this man's range. It really is. That's where I am currently with Lafferty.
Nice. Thank you so much. Yeah, I watched all that develop with you as well. And I was just like, as I said in my response video, you got into the obscure stories outside of 900 Grandmothers and the best of and all these different things. And I was like, somebody is on the internet on a video talking about been a long, long time. That's the Angel and the Monkey story. Talking about one of my all-time favorite Lafferty stories, Configuration of the North Shore, the one that I used to pass around to everybody and stuff. And I was just like, I'm in heaven now. It's finally happened, and your responses were wonderful. They were like this perfect first encounter Lafferty responses, this mixture of bafflement and insight within the bafflement of like, you were like, who could know what this is about? But maybe it's about this. And then it was like, yeah, I think you're right. It is about that. It was great. And I love that you're bringing up the magical realism thing. I've often tried to point that he has overlap there, that if he's not exactly magical realism, he's magical realism adjacent. I do think some of this stuff could just fit right in there. I think he has some novels that could fit right in there. And people have joked, and I said this before, people have joked that if he had a Latin surname, he would be more famous, because he'd be another, Marquez and, Borges or whoever, Borges is another one that I don't know what to call his fiction, but I think Lafferty's on a similar level there, though different, still. So yeah, no, that's really cool. It's really nice to hear that, because I am always trying to say, like, look, yes, he wrote science fiction, but science fiction doesn't exactly contain Lafferty, and I love that he wrote science fiction, and so he gets in there more with some stuff than others, but yeah, there's something more going on there as well. So yeah, thank you guys so much. I just loved hearing those stories. I think this is a super enlightening conversation on a lot of different levels, and I think other people will enjoy this too who are watching your channels and stuff. So with that, we will conclude this first video, kind of setting ourselves up to, like, you can't even believe, guys, what we're getting into next when we start diving into these stories. And we've now had a nice little build up to that, and now things are going to get weird. So be ready and be ready to enjoy it. It's fun weirdness, even if also definitely horror in a lot of ways, as Richard said. So that's coming next. And thank you so much, you guys, for joining me for this. And Absolutely. We'll see you next time.